There was a cake on the table, with my sister's name spelled out in blue icing, and next to a stack of paper plates, lying face down, was my valedictorian diploma. My parents had thrown a party that night. It just wasn't for me. The living room smelled like store-bought frosting and my mother's good candles, the ones she only lit for people she wanted to impress. Sophie stood in the middle of it all, glowing, holding her medical school acceptance letter like a trophy. I was 22 years old and I had just given the commencement speech to 900 people that afternoon. Nobody in that room had come to hear it, but the party wasn't the cruelest thing my parents did that week. It wasn't even close. Welcome back to Revenge Range, where the quietest people in the room are the ones you should never underestimate and where the truth always finds its way to the surface. If a story has ever moved you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe because what happened to me over the next 10 years is something I still can't fully believe. Let me take you back to that living room. It was the second week of June and the air conditioner was fighting a losing battle against the heat and the 12 people crammed inside. My aunt was there. 2 of my mother's church friends were there. The neighbors from across the street had brought a bottle of sparkling cider. Everyone had come to celebrate Sophie, my younger sister, who had gotten into medical school and she deserved a celebration. I want to be honest about that. Sophie had worked hard, and getting into med school is a real thing. I clapped when they announced it. I hugged her. I meant it. But 3 days earlier, I had walked across the stage in a cap and gown, and the dean had shaken my hand, and my name had been printed at the top of the program because I had the highest grades in my entire graduating class. Valedictorian. I had told my mother the date a month in advance. I had written it on the calendar on the refrigerator myself, and when the day came, none of them were in the audience. They said they had gotten the dates confused. They said there was so much going on with Sophie's news. So I sat in that living room holding a diploma nobody had asked to see, waiting for someone, anyone, to say the word congratulations to me. I kept waiting for a natural pause in the conversation. I kept opening my mouth and closing it again. Finally, when my father raised his glass to toast Sophie for the 3rd time, I thought maybe this was my moment too. Maybe he would turn to me next. I set my diploma on the table where he could see it. I said the words as softly as I could. I graduated valedictorian, Dad. That was all I said. I didn't ask for a party. I didn't ask for a cake with my name on it. I just said the words out loud, hoping he would hear them. My father lowered his glass. He looked at me the way you look at a fly that has landed on your food. And in front of my aunt, in front of the church friends, in front of Sophie, he said it. Stop begging for attention. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone has decided to pretend they didn't hear something. My mother laughed a small nervous laugh and steered the conversation back to Sophie's white coat ceremony. My aunt suddenly needed more cider, and I sat there with my face burning, holding a piece of paper that said I was the best student in my class, being told by my own father that wanting to be seen made me a beggar. I have replayed that sentence for 10 years. Stop begging for attention. One short sentence and it rearranged something inside me that I would spend a decade trying to put back. I have thought about what I could have said. I have thought about what I should have felt. But in that moment, sitting on my parents' couch, I felt something colder than anger. I felt like I finally understood a rule that had governed my whole childhood. A rule nobody had ever said out loud until now. In this family, love was a prize, and it had already been awarded to someone else. What I didn't understand yet was how much that rule had already cost me. That number was hidden in a drawer, and it had a lot of zeros. I stood up. I picked my diploma back up off the table, and I slid it into the tube it had come in, and I asked my mother if she would mind if I headed out early. I told her I had a long drive. She was refilling my aunt's glass, and she said, "Oh, are you sure, honey? There's still cake." And then she turned back to the conversation before I could even answer. That was the thing. She wasn't cruel about it. She wasn't cruel at all. She just genuinely did not notice that I was leaving my own family room by room forever. My father didn't look up. He was showing the neighbor a photo of the medical school campus on his phone, pointing at the buildings like he had built them himself. And Sophie. Sophie was the only one who saw me go. She was standing by the kitchen doorway, still holding her acceptance letter, and as I gathered my keys, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something closer to fear, like she had seen the edge of something and was afraid to look down. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something to me. Then our mother called her name to compose for a photo, and the look was gone, folded away, and Sophie turned and smiled for the camera. I let myself out the front door into the June heat. I remember thinking I would understand that look someday. I was right. It just took 10 years and a phone call from a payphone to explain it. I drove the 2 hours back to the city with the windows down and the diploma tube rolling around on the passenger seat. Somewhere around the halfway point on a dark stretch of highway with nothing but headlights and the hum of the road, I made a decision. I decided I was done asking, not done trying, not done working, just done asking anyone in that house to see me. If a person tells you clearly and in front of witnesses that your wanting to be noticed is a character flaw, you have two choices. You can spend your life shrinking to make them comfortable, or you can stop handing them the power to grade you. I chose the second one. And here is the part I am not proud of. The part I only understand now. I didn't just stop asking my family. I stopped asking anyone. I built a life where I would never again be caught wanting something from a person who could deny me. I picked a career made entirely of things that could be verified. I stopped calling people first. I got very, very good at being alone and calling it independence. At the time, it felt like strength. It felt like I had finally won. I didn't know that I had let my father's sentence build the walls of my entire adult life. I didn't know that stop begging for attention had become the quiet rule I lived by, the one I never said out loud. I thought I had walked away from that living room. The truth is, I never really left it. I just took it with me and mocked the door. 10 years is a long time to be quietly good at something. I became an accountant, a certified public accountant with a corner office by year 7 and a client list that trusted me with numbers that kept them up at night. I love the work. And I want to be clear that this is not a sad story about a woman who wasted her life. I was good. People relied on me. But I understand now why I chose it. Numbers don't play favorites. A column adds up or it doesn't. A ledger balances or it tells you exactly where the lie is hiding. There is no room in a spreadsheet for a father to decide that your contribution doesn't count. I could look at a set of books for a stranger and find the one that was in the wrong place, and no one had ever once told me I was begging for attention when I did it, so I lived inside that world. I called my mother twice a year on holidays, and the calls got shorter every time. I heard about Sophie, the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. She was in her residency. She had matched at a good hospital. My parents had co-signed a loan for her. They had helped her buy a condo near the hospital. Every update was about Sophie, and every update was fine because I had trained myself not to feel the shape of the thing that was missing. I built a good, orderly, solitary life, and I told myself I was happy. Then one Tuesday night, 3 weeks after my 32nd birthday, my phone rang at 11 at night from a number I didn't recognize, and my orderly little life started to come apart. Before I tell you about that call, you need to know about my grandfather, because he is the piece that makes the rest of it make sense. His name was Walter Hayes, my mother's father, and he was the only adult in my childhood who ever looked at me like I was already enough. Grandpa Walter had built a small chain of hardware stores from a single shop, sold them late in life, and quietly become the kind of comfortable that nobody talks about at the dinner table. He was not warm with everyone. He was warm with me. When I was 8, he taught me to reconcile a checkbook at his kitchen table, and he said I had a mind like a lockbox. When I was in high school, he came to every science fair and every debate that my parents were too busy for. The last real conversation I had with him, I was 21 and he was in a hospital bed and thin as a coat hanger, and he held my hand and said something I never forgot. Grandpa set something aside just for you, sweetheart. Just for you. Don't let anybody tell you different. I thought he meant it the way old people mean things when they're tired. A nice thing to say. I told him I loved him. He died 2 weeks later. At the funeral, my mother cried the loudest, and my father gave a eulogy about Walter's business sense that somehow made the whole thing about my father. And I stood at the back in a black dress and thought about that sentence. Set something aside just for you. I would find out 10 years later that my grandfather had meant it precisely and that the people crying at his funeral had already decided to steal it. Here is the part people always ask me about. If your grandfather told you he left you something, why didn't you chase it down at 21? I did. That's the thing. I wasn't a fool. About a month after the funeral, still numb, I asked my mother directly. I said, Grandpa told me he set something aside for me. And I asked her what it was. My mother didn't blink. She said, "Oh, honey." Grandpa was confused at the end. The medication, he said all sorts of things. There was nothing set aside. I promise you. She said it so gently, so sadly that I believed her. Why wouldn't I? I was grieving, and she was my mother. And she looked me in the eye. But something in me wouldn't let it go, so I did one more thing. I called the bank where Grandpa did his business, and I asked if there was any account or trust with my name on it. And the woman on the phone told me she couldn't discuss any account I wasn't listed on, and that if there was a trust, only the trustee could access the details. I asked who the trustee was. She couldn't tell me that either. I didn't have a document. I didn't have a name. I didn't even have proof that a trust existed. I was a 21-year-old with a dead grandfather and a mother who said there was nothing. And every door I pushed was locked from a side I couldn't reach. So I stopped pushing, not because I was stupid, because there was nowhere left to push. One didn't know was that the trustee, the one person who could open that door, was sitting across from me at Thanksgiving every single year. So I let it go. I want you to understand that this wasn't laziness or forgiveness. It was survival. When you are 21 and grieving and the people who are supposed to love you have told you both that you beg for attention and that your grandfather's love was just confusion, you learn to stop reaching for things you can't have. Reaching hurts. Not reaching is quieter. I filed the whole thing away in the same drawer where I kept the memory of that party. The drawer marked things that will destroy me if I open them. And I got very good at not opening drawers. The years went by. I passed my CPA exam. I moved into a better apartment. I dated a little, but never seriously because getting serious meant needing someone. And I had made a religion out of not needing anyone. Every so often, the memory would surface. I would be balancing a client's estate account, some ordinary trust with some ordinary family, and I would feel a cold finger touch the back of my neck. Set something aside just for you and I would push it back down, because there was nothing I could do about it, and a thing you can do nothing about is just a wound you keep reopening. I told myself Grandpa had been confused. I told myself my mother wouldn't lie to me about something like that. I told myself a lot of things in those 10 years, and I believed most of them because the alternative was a version of my family, so cold I couldn't survive imagining it. It turned out my imagination hadn't gone nearly far enough. The truth was colder than anything I let myself picture, and it was about to call me collect. It was a Tuesday in the fall, and I remember it was raining because I could hear it against the windows of my apartment. I was on my couch reviewing a client file, a glass of wine going warm beside me, when my phone lit up on the coffee table. The number was one I didn't recognize, and it had an area code from a part of the state I hadn't thought about in years. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I don't answer numbers I don't know. It's a small rule, but it's mine, part of the fortress. So, I let it ring. It stopped. And then, almost immediately, it started again. Same number. I looked at it and felt that cold finger on the back of my neck again. The one I had spent a decade learning to ignore. Something about the persistence of it. People don't call twice at 11 at night, unless something is wrong. Or unless they've been standing somewhere for a long time working up the nerve. It stopped a second time. I set the phone down. I told myself if it was important, they'd leave a message. I picked my wine back up, and then it rang a third time. And this time, I didn't decide to answer it so much as my hand just reached out and did it before my fortress could stop me. I put the phone to my ear. For a second, there was nothing but the sound of rain on the other end too, and traffic, and the particular hollow echo of an outdoor line, and then a voice thick and broken and unmistakable even after all these years, said a single name that turned my blood to ice water. Evie. Nobody had called me Evie in 10 years. My parents called me Evelyn when they called me at all. My colleagues called me by my last name. Evie was a child's name. My sister's name for me from a time before the party, before the living room, before I learned the rules. Hearing it come out of the phone in that broken voice did something to my chest that I hadn't felt in a decade. It cracked the door I'd spent 10 years welding shut. "Sophie," I said. My own voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. There was a sound on the other end that took me a second to identify, and then I realized she was crying. The kind of crying you do when you've already been crying for a long time, and your body has run out of the dramatic part and is just leaking. Traffic hissed past behind her. I heard the mechanical clunk of coins and I thought, is she on a payphone? Who is on a payphone in this day and age? And that detail more than the tears told me how far down she was. You don't stand at a payphone in the rain at 11 at night unless your own phone is gone, or shut off, or you're somewhere you don't want traced, or you have simply hit a floor you didn't know existed. My cautious, careful fortress-building brain lit up with alarms. This was my sister, the golden child, the doctor, the one they threw the party for. And she was sobbing into a payphone like a runaway. I stood up off the couch without deciding to Ophi, "Where are you? What's wrong?" And through the tears, she said the sentence that ended the life I'd built. "I have to tell you what Mom and Dad did. I have to tell you what Mom and Dad did. I have to tell you what Mom and Dad did." I stood in my living room with the rain running down the black windows, and I felt the floor of my careful life tilt under me. 10 years. 10 years of silence, of 2 calls, a year of Sophie being a distant weather report, and now she was on a payphone in some town I couldn't picture telling me our parents had done something. My accountant's brain, the part that trusts nothing until it's verified, tried to slow everything down. "Sophie, it's the middle of the night. You're crying on a payphone. Start from the beginning. Where are you?" She said the name of a town about 3 hours north of me, a place I'd never been. And she said she'd taken a bus there, and I didn't understand any of it yet. "Why are you on a payphone?" I asked. She laughed. A terrible wet sound. "Because I sold my phone. Because I sold a lot of things." I made myself brave. Part of me, I'll admit, was still braced for a trick. When someone who watched your father humiliate you and then smiled for a photo suddenly calls you sobbing after a decade, you don't just open your arms. You keep one hand on the door. "Okay," I said carefully. "You said Mom and Dad did something. Sophie, that was 10 years ago. Whatever it was, why are you calling me now at 11 from a payphone to tell me?" There was a long silence on the line, just rain and traffic and the sound of my sister gathering herself. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was quieter, steadier, like a person who has decided to jump because I lost my license, she said. "I lost everything and I can't carry this anymore." "You lost your license?" I said of everything she could have said, that was the last thing I expected. Sophie was a doctor. Sophie was the whole point. Sophie was the reason there had been a cake and a party and a father pointing at a campus like he owned it. "Your medical license?" "Yes," she said 6 months ago. And then it came out of her in pieces. The way a confession comes out when the person has held it so long, it's calcified. She told me the hospital, the specialty, the years of residency, and then the part where it went wrong. She told me she'd started making mistakes. Small ones then, not small ones. She told me she'd been drinking to sleep and taking things to wake up, and that one night on a long shift, she made an error with a patient's medication that could have killed him and did not by luck. But the board found out, and there was a review, and at the end of it, she was no longer allowed to practice medicine anywhere in this country. I sat back down on the couch. I didn't feel triumph. I want you to know that some part of me, the wounded part, had spent 10 years imagining Sophie getting some cosmic comeuppance. And now that it was happening, live into my ear. It just felt like watching a building I used to live in burn down. "Sophie, I'm sorry," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it. "But I still don't understand what this has to do with Mom and Dad or with me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made the cold finger on my neck press all the way down my spine. "Because none of it was ever mine, Evie. It was never my dream. It was never even my money. It was never my dream. I heard those words, and something in me went very still. The way I go still when a client's numbers are almost right, but not quite. And I know there's a hidden account somewhere. What do you mean it was never your dream, Sophie? You went to medical school. You wanted to be a doctor. She made that wet laugh again. Did I? Or did they decide I was going to be one when I was 16 and then just never stopped deciding it? And she told me about her side of that childhood, the side I'd never seen because I was too busy being invisible on the other side of it. She told me what it was like to be the one they chose. How every good grade was a relief instead of a joy because a bad one was a catastrophe. How Dad would introduce her to strangers as my daughter, the future doctor, when she was 14 and had never so much as set foot in a hospital. How the party that night, the one with the cake, hadn't felt like a celebration to her at all. It had felt like a door locking. You got to leave, she said. You walked out that night and you got to become whoever you wanted. I had to stay and become the thing they'd already spent everything to make me. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to hate her, and I had 10 years of reasons to. But sitting on my couch listening to my sister describe the golden cage, I understood something I hadn't before. There are two ways to be crushed by a parent who keeps score. You can be the one they don't spend on, or you can be the one they spend everything on. Neither of us had ever really been free. Spent everything, I repeated. It was an odd phrase, and my brain snagged on it because my parents were not wealthy people. My father managed a regional sales team for most of his life. My mother did the books for a dental office. They lived in a fine, ordinary house. Medical school costs a fortune. And I had always vaguely assumed there were loans, that Sophie was buried under $200,000 of debt like every other doctor her age. Sophie, what do you mean spent everything? You had loans. That's what they told everyone. She said, that's what they told you. There weren't any loans, Evie. Not really. There was money. There was always money. And I've spent 10 years pretending I didn't know exactly where it came from. I was on my feet again. The wine glass was still on the coffee table, gone completely warm now, and I remember staring at it because it was the only ordinary thing in the room. Where did it come from? I asked. My voice had gone flat and careful, the voice I use when a number is about to reveal a crime. Sophie didn't answer right away. I heard her feed another coin into the payphone, and the traffic behind her and her breathing, ragged and scared. I understood in that pause that she was standing at the edge of something she had promised herself for 10 years she would never say out loud. And I understood that when she said it, neither of us could go back to being the people we'd been an hour before. Sophie, I said, where did the money come from? And in the smallest voice I have ever heard from another human being, my sister said one name, and it was the name of the only person who had ever truly seen me. Grandpa Walter. Grandpa Walter. The name landed in my chest, like a stone dropped down a well, and I waited to hear it hit bottom. What about Grandpa Walter? I said. I was gripping the phone hard enough that my knuckles locked. Every locked drawer I had spent 10 years keeping shut was rattling at once. Set something aside just for you. The bank that couldn't tell me anything. My mother's gentle, sad, lying face. The trustee I could never find. Evie, Sophie said. And now she was crying again, but differently. The way you cry when you're finally telling the truth after years of the lie eating you alive. You have to understand. I was 20 years old. I didn't know at first. I swear to you, I didn't know at first. Didn't know what she fed another coin into the machine. I could picture her now, though I'd never seen the place. A woman who used to be a doctor, standing under a broken streetlight at a payphone in the rain, spending her last coins to unburden herself onto the sister she helped ruin. The money that paid for medical school, she said the condo. My whole life. It wasn't loans, Evie. It was Grandpa's. He left it to you. All of it. He left it to you and Mom and Dad took it and they gave it to me. The room went silent except for the rain. I sat down on the floor. Not the couch, the floor, my back against the base of it because my legs had simply decided not to hold me anymore. 10 years of a story I'd told myself, that Grandpa had been confused, that there was nothing, that my mother wouldn't lie. All of it dissolving in a single sentence from a payphone. How? I said. It was all I could manage. How did they take it? There's a moment when you're going through a set of books and you finally find the fraud where the world reorganizes itself. Everything you thought was one shape turns out to be another. Sitting on my apartment floor with the phone against my ear, I lived that moment in real time. Except the books were my whole life. Grandpa made a will. Sophie said a real one with a lawyer. He set up a trust. It was all for you, Evie. He didn't leave the house or the cars. Those went to Mom. But the money, the real money, the money he made selling the stores, he put it in a trust with your name on it. $2.4 million. I stopped breathing. I am an accountant. I hear numbers all day. I have signed off on figures larger than that without my pulse changing. But this number went through me like a current because it wasn't a client's number. It was mine. It had always been mine. He named Dad as the trustee. Sophie went on because you were only 21 and someone had to manage it until you were older. But Dad didn't manage it until you were older. But Dad didn't manage it after Grandpa died, before anyone even read the will. Dad had another one made, a fake one. It left everything to Mom, and it dissolved the trust. Mom signed as a witness. They forged Grandpa's signature. And then Dad, as the person managing the money, just moved it into an account for me to make me a doctor. I closed my eyes. On the other side of the country, in a house I grew up in, my parents had sat me down after that funeral and told me my grandfather was confused. And the whole time the document that would have proven them liars was sitting in a drawer wearing a signature that was never really his. I don't know how long I sat on that floor. The rain kept coming. Sophie kept talking, but for a little while, I couldn't hear her because my mind had left the room and gone back through 10 years, reassembling every piece with the new information the way you read a whole column once you find the error. The party, of course, they'd already made their decision by then. They weren't just ignoring my valedictorian speech out of carelessness. They were ignoring the girl they had just robbed. Stop begging for attention wasn't cruelty in a vacuum. It was a man protecting a crime. Making sure the daughter he'd stolen from learned to want nothing, to ask for nothing, to disappear so quietly she'd never think to look in the drawer. The bank that couldn't help me because the trustee, the only one who could open the door, was the thief. My mother's gentle, sad face telling me Grandpa was confused. She'd already signed the fake. She wasn't grieving her father's death when she said that. She was managing a witness. Every locked drawer in me flew open at once. And behind every one of them was the same face, my father's, lowering his glass at that party, looking at me like a fly on his food. I became aware that Sophie was saying my name. Evie. Evie, are you there? Please say something. I opened my eyes. Outside, a car went past on the wet street, its headlights sweeping across my ceiling. I felt strangely, terribly calm. The kind of calm that comes after the number finally balances, even when what it balances to is a horror. I'm here, I said. My voice did not shake. Sophie, I need you to tell me one thing, and I need you to tell me the truth. Is there any proof, or is this just your word against theirs? The question hung there in the rain-filled silence, and I realized my whole future was balanced on Sophie's answer. Because here is what my 10 years as an accountant had taught me. The cold, professional truth that even my grief couldn't push aside. Feelings are not evidence. A confession from a disgraced doctor on a payphone 3 states away, 10 years after the fact, is not evidence. If all Sophie had was her memory and her guilt, then this changed everything about how I understood my family, and nothing about what I could actually do. My parents would deny it. They would say Sophie was an addict who'd lost her license and her mind, that she was lashing out, that she'd say anything. And a part of me, the part that had learned to expect the locked door, was already bracing to be told once again that there was nothing. Sophie, I said again slowly. The way you speak to someone standing on a ledge. This is important. The will Grandpa really made. The trust, the forgery. Is any of it written down anywhere? Is there anything a person could hold in their hands? Or is it only what you remember? I heard her breathing. I heard a coin drop into the payphone and a recorded voice somewhere telling her to deposit more money to continue the call and the clatter of her feeding it. She was running out of coins. She was running out of everything. There was a lawyer, she said finally, the one who made the real will, but he died a few years ago. And I don't think there are copies. Dad made sure. And I was 20, Evie. I wasn't in the rooms where they did the paperwork. My heart, which had risen for just a second, started to sink. Word against word. The oldest, most useless kind of truth. And then Sophie said so quietly, I almost missed it under the traffic. But there's one thing they don't know I have. I couldn't do it, Evie. They told me to get rid of it and I couldn't. What couldn't you get rid of? I was standing again. I don't remember getting up. The whole apartment had narrowed to the 6 in between my ear and the phone. Sophie's voice came through thin and shaking, and I understood that she was about to hand me the one thing that could turn a ghost story into a case. About 2 years into medical school, she said, I started to figure it out. Little things, a comment Dad made, the fact that we never talked about loans. And one day I was home for a holiday and I went looking because I couldn't stand not knowing. And in the back of Dad's filing cabinet, in a folder marked with Grandpa's name, I found 2 wills. 2 Evie. One was the fake, the one that went to the court, and underneath it was the other one, the real one. Grandpa's actual signature, notarized, dated, with a whole section setting up the trust in your name. Dad had kept the original. I think he was afraid to destroy it. Or maybe he just forgot it was there. And when I found it, I understood everything all at once. The same way you must be understanding it right now. I could barely speak. You found the real will. I took it, she said. I don't even know why. I was terrified. I put it in the lining of an old suitcase and I've moved it from apartment to apartment for 8 years. And when Mom and Dad asked me once if I'd ever seen anything, I lied. They think it's gone. But I have it, Evie. I've had it this whole time. And there it was. The thing I would carry in my mind through everything that came after. Not a feeling, not a memory. A document. Real and physical. Sitting in the lining of a suitcase in a bus station locker. 3 hours north of me. They forged Grandpa's will, my sister said, and her voice finally broke all the way open. The money he left for you, they used it to make me a doctor. And I have the proof. I did not scream. I think a lot of people hearing what I just heard would have screamed or wept or hurled the wine glass across the room. I thought about why I didn't, and I believe it's because of the 10 years I spent training myself never again to be caught in the open, wanting, exposed. All that armor, all that loneliness I'd built. And it turned out it had made me into exactly the kind of person you'd want in the room when the $2.4 million fraud came to light. Someone who could feel the earthquake and still read the instruments. How much is left? I said. Sophie went quiet, thrown by the question. What? The trust was $2.4 million. Medical school, the condo, 10 years of your life. How much of it is left? It was, I understand, a strange first question. Not how could they or I loved him or I'll never forgive them. Just the number, but numbers were the one language I trusted. And in that moment, they were the only thing keeping me upright. I don't know exactly, Sophie said. Med school was maybe $300,000 all in. The condo they bought outright, that was another $300,000. I never saw statements. Dad handled all of it. But Evie, most of it. I think most of it is still there. Dad's careful. He didn't spend it wild. He just moved it and sat on it and let it grow. Most of it's still there. Somewhere around $1.5 million, maybe more, sitting in an account with my father's name where my grandfather had meant to put mine. I looked at my own reflection in the black window, a calm-faced woman holding a phone, and I made her a promise. Okay, I said to Sophie, tell me exactly how they did it. All of it. Don't leave anything out. So she told me, and I listened the way I listen to a client explaining a mess they need me to untangle, which is to say completely, without judgment, taking mental notes. Grandpa Walter had gone to a lawyer 2 years before he died and set up a revocable trust. The kind, wealthy, careful people use so their money skips the long public misery of probate. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary. It named my father as the successor trustee, the person who would manage the money on my behalf until I turned 30, because Grandpa, God bless him, had trusted his son-in-law to hold the door until his granddaughter was old enough to walk through it. That trust was the mistake, not a legal mistake, a human one. Because when Walter died, my father was the only person with the authority to touch that account. And the only document standing between him and the money was a will he could simply replace. They had papers drawn up, Sophie said. Not Grandpa's lawyer, some other guy. First, a revocation, a document saying Grandpa had dissolved the trust himself of his own free will a few weeks before he died, and pulled the money back into his personal account. Then a new will, leaving everything in that account to Mom. Grandpa's signature was forged on both, and Mom signed as a witness. And because Dad was the successor trustee, he was the one the bank relied on to confirm what had happened to the trust. So, he walked in with a notarized revocation dated before the death, moved the money out himself, and it all looked legal on paper. No court really looked hard because who looks hard at a grieving family's paperwork? The estate was small on paper, the house, the cars, a modest account. Nobody knew there had ever been $2.44 million because Grandpa had kept the trust quiet. Only Dad knew, and once he moved it, only Dad knew where it went. I sat with that. The elegance of it, the coldness of it. My grandfather's trust in his own son-in-law had been the key that unlocked the theft. And the signature on the fake will. I said, "You saw it. Was it good? Was it good?" Sophie repeated. "Avi, I don't know. I'm not a handwriting expert. It looked like his. But that's the whole point, isn't it? It only has to fool people who aren't looking." She was right. And she was also, without knowing it, describing exactly where the crack in my father's perfect crime was going to open. Because a signature that only has to fool people who aren't looking falls apart the moment someone looks. And I knew sitting on that floor that I was going to make someone look. But I was getting ahead of myself, and my accountant's discipline pulled me back. Word against word was useless. A stolen original will was better. Much better. But a stolen document raises its own questions in a courtroom. How did you get it? Why did you wait? I needed to think about this, the way I'd think about building a case for an audit. Brick by verifiable brick. "Sophie," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully now, because what happens next depends on you doing exactly the right thing." "That will the real one in the suitcase. Where is it right now?" "This second." "In a locker," she said, "at the bus station here. I put it there because I was afraid to carry it, and afraid to leave it wherever I'm staying." "Good, leave it there. Don't move it. Don't mail it. Don't mail it. Don't take a photo of it and text it to anyone. Do you understand? That piece of paper is the most valuable thing either of us has ever touched. And I need it to arrive in a lawyer's hands in a way that nobody can ever question." There was a silence. Then Sophie said something that made my stomach drop, because it meant the story was not as clean as I'd let myself hope. "Evie," she said, "there's more. It's not just their signatures on that fake will. There's something with my name on it too. Something with your name on it?" I closed my eyes. Of course there was. Fraud is never as clean as the person telling you about it wants it to be. And neither are the people who confess. "Tell me," I said. Sophie's voice had gone small and ashamed. When I was 22, after I'd already started figuring it out, Mom and Dad had me sign some papers. They said it was for the money for my condo, a gift letter, that kind of thing. So it wouldn't look like a loan. I read enough of it to understand it was money from Grandpa's account. I understood, Evie. I wasn't a child anymore. I was 22 and I signed a paper that helped move your inheritance. And I told myself it was fine because they were my parents and they said it was fine. She was crying again. So it's not just their crime. I signed. I took the condo. I took the tuition. For years, I've been telling myself I was a victim too. And I was. But I also signed my name. And I knew, and I did it anyway. And there it was. The thing that made this a real story instead of a fairy tale. My sister was not an innocent messenger. She was a co-conspirator who'd had a change of heart 10 years too late, standing at a payphone because her own conscience had finally caught up with her. I could have hated her all over again in that moment. Part of me did. But another part of me, The part that had once been a little girl at a kitchen table learning to reconcile a checkbook, understood something my father never would. There is a difference between a person who commits a crime and never looks back, and a person who commits a crime and spends 10 years unable to burn the evidence. Sophie had kept the will. That had to mean something. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The rain had softened to a drizzle against my windows. And 3 hours away, I imagined it was doing the same thing to my sister at her payphone. Two women who used to be girls in the same house, connected by a thin line of copper and everything our parents had done to us. "Why now, Sophie?" I asked. And this time it wasn't an accusation. It was a real question. "You've had this for 8 years. You could have told me any time. Why tonight?" She was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was steadier than it had been the whole call, like she'd finally reached the bottom and found solid ground. "Because I have nothing left to protect," she said. "For 10 years, I kept quiet because I had a career and a condo and a life they'd built for me, and telling the truth would have burned it all down. So I told myself the lie that I earned it. That Grandpa really did want it this way. That you were fine off in your city with your numbers. That you didn't need it. But now the career's gone, the license is gone, the condo went to pay for lawyers when the board came after me. I have nothing they gave me anymore. And it turns out that when you've got nothing left to lose, the truth is the only thing you can still afford. I understood that. God help me. I understood it completely. It had taken losing everything for her to be honest. And it had taken a payphone call to make me finally open every drawer I'd welded shut. "Okay," I said. "Here's what we're going to do." But before I could say it, Sophie interrupted me with the sentence that made it all suddenly terrifyingly real. "I have the real will, Evie, Grandpa's real will. The original's still in the locker where I put it. I'm holding a copy of it right now." "You're holding it right now?" I thought she'd said it was in the locker. "A copy?" she said quickly. "I made one copy years ago on a library machine in case anything ever happened to the original. It's in my coat pocket. I've been carrying it around for weeks, trying to decide whether to call you, and that was the moment I understood that my sister had come here to this town, to this payphone, on purpose. She hadn't drunk dialed me in a spiral. She had sold her phone, taken a bus 3 hours, put the original in a bus station locker, and made a copy she could carry. All so she could stand in the rain and finally do the one right thing left available to her. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it told me who she was choosing to be now. At the bottom of everything. "Sophie," I said, "I want to see you in person. Bring the original. I'll come to you." We arranged it for 2 days later, a diner off the highway in her town, neutral ground, daylight, and I told her the other thing, the thing that mattered most. "When I get there," I said, "you're going to hand me that will, and then you and I are going to sit down with an attorney because I am not going to do anything with this that isn't perfectly clean and completely legal. Do you understand me? I'm an accountant, Sophie. I don't do things in the dark. Whatever happens next is going to happen in the light, in a courtroom if it has to, with every piece of paper accounted for. That's the only way I know how to win." She was crying again, but it was a different kind of crying now, the kind that has relief buried inside it. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Evie." Then the recorded voice cut in telling her to deposit more money, and she said she was out of coins, and the line went dead. I stood alone in my apartment in the drizzle, holding a silent phone, 32 years old. And for the first time in 10 years, I knew exactly what I wanted. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't fall apart either. Instead, I did what I always do when the ground moves under me. I got organized. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I built a timeline, the way I'd build one for a client facing an audit. Grandpa's death, the funeral, the conversation where my mother said he was confused, the call to the bank, my valedictorian party dated to the same June, Sophie's medical school, the condo, the years. I wrote it all down in columns. And as the columns filled, the pattern that had been invisible for a decade became so obvious, I couldn't believe I'd ever missed it. But of course I'd missed it. You can't see a crime you've been trained not to look for. 2 days later, I drove north. 3 hours of highway, farmland giving way to a tired little town and a diner, with a flickering sign where my sister was waiting in a corner booth. I almost didn't recognize her. The Sophie in my memory was luminous, holding an acceptance letter under our mother's good candles. The woman in the booth was thin and gray-faced, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was the only warm thing in the world. She looked up when the bell over the door rang, and when she saw me, her face did something complicated. Hope and shame and grief all at once. I slid into the booth across from her. For a second, neither of us knew what to do. Two strangers who shared a childhood. Then she reached into her bag with shaking hands and pulled out a manila envelope, soft and worn from being carried, and she set it on the table between us. "It's all there," she said. "The real one." "I'm so sorry, Evie. I'm so sorry it took me this long." I looked at the envelope. I didn't open it yet. I wasn't ready for what it would make real. I opened the envelope in that diner booth with a chipped coffee mug at my elbow and my sister watching me like a woman awaiting sentencing. Inside was a document thick official, the paper heavier than normal paper, the way legal documents used to be made when people still believed in the weight of things. Last will and testament of Walter James Hayes. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I read it the way I read everything, slowly from the top. And when I reached the section that mattered, the world went quiet. There it was, in plain legal language, a trust established in my name, Evelyn Barrett, as sole beneficiary, the full amount from the sale of the hardware business. My father named a successor trustee to manage it until my 30th birthday, at which point it would pass entirely to me. And at the bottom, my grandfather's signature, the real one. The same careful hand that had once shown me how to reconcile a checkbook next to the stamp and signature of a notary dated 18 months before he died. I had spent 10 years believing he was confused. I had spent 10 years believing my mother. And here in a worn envelope carried across 8 years and a dozen apartments by my ghoul-tridden sister was proof that my grandfather had known exactly what he wanted, had said it clearly in writing, in front of a notary, and that everyone who told me otherwise had been lying to my face. "I need to see the other one," I said, "the one they filed with the court." "You can pull it," Sophie said. "It's public. It went through probate. Anybody can request a copy." Of course, the fake was public and the truth had been hidden. That was the whole architecture of it. And now I held both halves and side by side. I knew that signature was going to betray my father the way he betrayed me. Driving home from that diner, the envelope zipped into my bag like it was made of plutonium. I made a mistake. Not a legal one, an emotional one. I let myself feel like I'd already won. It's a natural thing and I forgive myself for it now. But at the time it nearly steered me wrong. I had the real will. I had the public fake. I had a confession from my sister. $2.4 million. Most of it presumably still sitting in an account. Had my grandfather's true intentions stamped and notarized on heavy paper in my bag. In my accountant's mind, it was a solved equation. You find the fraud, you present the evidence. The money comes back. The guilty parties are exposed. Clean, balanced, justice as a matter of arithmetic. I remember stopping at a gas station halfway home and buying a coffee and feeling for the first time in a decade something like triumph. I let myself imagine my father's face when he understood I knew. I let myself imagine the money returned, the trust restored, my grandfather's real wishes finally honored. I even let myself imagine for one dangerous minute an apology. That was my mistake. That imagined apology because it revealed the thing I still wanted underneath the money. I wanted them to finally admit they'd been wrong about me. I wanted to stop begging by force. What I didn't understand, standing in that gas station with my coffee, was that having the evidence and winning the fight were two entirely different things, and that the space between them was full of choices. I hadn't even imagined yet, choices that would cost me. Because the next morning I sat down across from an attorney and she took one look at my beautiful, balanced arithmetic case, and she asked me a question that turned all my triumph to ash. She asked me if I understood that using this evidence could send my sister to prison too. The attorney's name was Grace Okafor, and she came recommended as the best probate litigator in the city, the kind of lawyer other lawyers hire. Her office was all clean lines and quiet, and she listened to my whole story without interrupting once, taking notes in a small, careful hand, her face giving nothing away. When I finished, she laid down her pen. "First, the good news," she said. "You have standing. You were the named beneficiary of the trust, which means you have a direct financial interest in the estate. And normally, I'd tell you a 10-year-old will contest as a non-starter because the window to challenge a will is usually just a few years. But there is a doctrine called the discovery rule. In this state, when a will contest involves fraud or forgery, the clock doesn't start when the will is filed. It starts when you discover the fraud or reasonably could have. You discovered it 3 days ago, and there was no way you could have known sooner. So we have a strong argument that you're well within time, legally. This is alive." I felt the triumph swell back up. "So we can get the money back, probably." "Yes, if a forensic document examiner confirms the signature on the filed will is forged, we have your grandfather's genuine will to compare it against. That's powerful. This is a strong case, Evelyn. Maybe the strongest forged will case I've seen." "Then what's the bad news?" Grace folded her hands. "The bad news is that forging the will and misappropriating trust funds aren't just civil wrongs, they're crimes. Forgery, fraud, larceny by a trustee. If I take this evidence and file it, and it becomes part of the public record, I can't control what a prosecutor does with it. Your parents could be charged criminally. They could go to prison." I nodded. That part I'd already accepted. "Good," I started to say, but Grace held up one hand and her eyes were kind and terrible. "Evelyn," she said, "your sister signed a gift letter that helped move the funds. She knowingly accepted proceeds of the fraud. In the eyes of the law, that can make her a participant. If your parents go down, there is a real chance your sister goes down with them. The same evidence that saves you could put the woman who just handed you that will in a prison cell." I sat in that clean, quiet office and felt my beautiful arithmetic collapse. I am a person who believes in balanced books. I believe that every wrong has a corresponding right, that every debt has a payment, that if you work the numbers honestly, they resolve. And here was a set of numbers that would not resolve. If I wanted justice, if I wanted my grandfather's true wishes honored and my father held accountable and the money that was always mine returned, the same act that delivered all of that could destroy the one person in my family who had finally chosen the truth. The math did not balance. It could not be made to balance. Save myself and possibly imprison my sister, or protect my sister and let the theft stand. Grace watched me work through it. She'd clearly seen this look on faces before. "There are options," she said gently. "It's not necessarily all or nothing, but you need to understand the terrain before you take a single step, because once I file, some of this leaves your hands. So, I'm going to ask you to go home and think about a question that has nothing to do with the law." "What question?" She leaned back. "What do you actually want? Not what you're owed. Not what's fair. When do you want to be true a year from now about you? Because I've watched people win these cases and lose themselves. They get every dollar and they turn into the very thing that hurt them. So, before we file a single page, I need you to decide who you're willing to become to win this." I drove home with that question sitting in my chest like a stone. For 10 years, I'd wanted one thing so badly I'd built my whole life around not admitting it. Now, finally within reach of it, I had to ask myself what it was actually going to cost. That night, I did the only thing I know how to do when I can't think straight. I spread it all out like a set of books. I cleared my kitchen table, and I laid the documents across it. The real will, the copy of the fake, my timeline, Grace's notes, and I tried to reduce the whole impossible thing to columns, assets, liabilities, what was owed to me, what I would spend to collect it. But some ledgers don't balance in dollars. I sat there past midnight, and I kept coming back to my sister's face in that diner booth, thin and gray and afraid, holding a coffee cup like it was the only warm thing left. Sophie had signed a paper at 22 that she should not have signed. That was a real thing, a true entry in the ledger. But she had also carried the proof of my father's crime through 8 years, and a dozen apartments when destroying it would have kept her safe. And then, with nothing left to protect, she had spent her last coins to give it to me. My father, meanwhile, had built a perfect crime and slept soundly for a decade. I looked at the two of them side by side in the ledger of who deserved what, and I understood that the law would treat them almost the same, and that this was the whole problem. Numbers don't play favorites. That was the thing I'd built my life on. A column adds up or it doesn't. But people do play favorites. And here I was holding the scales, discovering that I had favorites too. And that my favorite was the one who'd wronged me and repented, not the one who'd wronged me and never would. The law couldn't see that difference. Only I could. And only I could decide whether it mattered. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. And it was the kind of decision that once made cannot be unmade. I called Grace's office when it opened and I told her I wanted to move forward, but on specific terms. I wanted to file a civil contest of the will first, not a criminal complaint. I wanted to use the strength of the evidence, the forged signature, the genuine will as leverage to recover the trust. And I wanted to structure it so that the pressure fell on my father, the architect, and not on my sister. You want to keep the criminal option in your back pocket, Grace said, as leverage, without pulling the trigger on it. Yes, that's a strategy, but it's a dangerous one. Once your parents realize you have the original will, they'll panic. Panicked people do unpredictable things, and I still can't guarantee a prosecutor won't get interested on their own once this is in the public record. I understand. I said, file it civilly. Let's start there. There was a pause, and then Grace said, all right. I'll need you to sign a retainer and an authorization for me to act on your behalf. Once you sign, I file within the week. After that, your parents will be served with notice that their daughter is contesting your grandfather's will. There is no quiet way to do this, Evelyn. The moment you sign, the family you've been avoiding for 10 years knows that you know everything. I looked at the pen she slid across the desk. This was the door. On this side of it, I was still the quiet daughter who kept the peace by disappearing. On the other side, I was a woman dragging her own parents into court. I thought about my grandfather's hand teaching me to balance a ledger. Then I picked up the pen and I signed. Grace filed 4 days later. I know the exact day because I spent it staring at my phone the way you stare at a fuse you've already lit. Somewhere north of me, a process server was walking up the path to the house I grew up in, the house with the good candles and the refrigerator calendar, and handing my father a set of papers with a court seal on them. I tried to work. I couldn't. I sat in my corner office pretending to review a client's quarterly statements, and I watched the clock, and I imagined my father opening that envelope. It happened at 4:17 in the afternoon. That's when my phone lit up with my mother's name, the first time she had called me first and longer than I could remember. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. My mother, who had not called me first in years, was suddenly desperate to reach me, and I knew exactly why. And I let every single call ring through to voicemail. And I did not listen to a single message. It was the strangest feeling. For 10 years, I had it in a place I never admitted to. For my mother to want to talk to me, to reach for me, to need to hear my voice. And now she did finally. And I understood that she wasn't reaching for me. She was reaching for the papers. She was managing a witness again, the way she'd been managing me my whole life. When the calls finally stopped, a text came through, blunt and short. From my mother, the woman who once told me my grandfather was confused. We can explain. I looked at that message for a long time, then I forwarded it to Grace. Because a woman offering to explain a crime is a woman who's just admitted there's a crime to explain. The case turned, truly turned, in a lab that smelled like toner and old paper. Grace had retained a forensic document examiner, a soft-spoken man in his 60s named Dr. Alvarez, who had testified in more forgery cases than he could count. I was allowed to be there when he presented his findings, and I will never forget it because it was the moment the fraud stopped being my word and my sister's word and became a fact. He had the two documents side by side under magnification. The genuine will my sister had carried for 8 years, and the fake one from the public probate file. On a large screen, he showed us both signatures blown up huge. My grandfather's real name written twice. A genuine signature, Dr. Alvarez said, has natural variation, but it also has consistent underlying rhythm, the pen speed, the pressure, the way the loops close. He pointed to the genuine one. This is a man signing his name the way he signed it 10,000 times. Fast, unconscious, confident. Then he pointed to the other. This is someone drawing a picture of that signature. Look at the tremor here. The hesitation at the start of each letter. The pen lifts where there shouldn't be any. This isn't a signature. It's a careful copy. In my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, the signature on the filed will was not made by the same hand that signed the genuine will. Grace looked at me. That's it, she said quietly. That holds up. That's what wins. I looked at the screen at my grandfather's real name and the tremoring forgery of it, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not victory, grief. Because the tremor in that fake signature was my father's tremor. The tiny hesitation of a man carefully drawing a dead man's name so he could rob his own daughter. My father's hand was on that screen, and it was shaking. Before the mediation, there was a conference, a required meeting where both sides sit in the same room to see if things can be resolved without a trial. It was the first time I had been in a room with my parents in years. Grace warned me it would be hard. She had no idea. My father walked in looking older than I remembered, but the same in the ways that mattered. He did not look ashamed. He looked inconvenienced. He looked at me across that conference table the way he'd looked at me across the living room 10 years ago, like I was a problem that had interrupted his evening. And when Grace laid out the evidence, the genuine will, the forensic report, the forged signature magnified for all to see, my father did not crumble. He did something worse, he explained himself. You want to know why I did it? He said, and his voice was steady, almost proud. Fine, I'll tell you. Your grandfather was a sentimental old man who wanted to leave $2.4 million, $4 million to a girl who was going to become an accountant. An accountant? Meanwhile, your sister had the chance to become a doctor. A doctor in this family. Do you have any idea what that meant? He leaned forward. A doctor in this family was worth more than an accountant. I did what a father does. I put the resources where they'd do the most good for this family's name. I'm not sorry. I'd do it again. The room was silent. My mother stared at the table. Grace's pen had stopped moving. And I sat there and I felt the last thing die. The small, stubborn hope I'd carried into that room without admitting it. The hope that when he finally understood what he'd done, he'd be sorry. He wasn't going to be sorry. He genuinely believed he'd been a good father. There was no family here to save. There never had been. And that somehow set me free. My mother cried at that conference, and for one moment, one weak human moment, I almost reached for her. Old wiring runs deep. When your mother cries, some ancient part of you wants to make it stop. Even if she's crying about a crime she committed against you, but I made myself watch her carefully, the way Dr. Alvarez watched a signature, looking for the underlying rhythm beneath the surface. And what I saw was not remorse. My mother was not crying because she had helped forge her own father's will and steal from her own daughter. She was crying because it had come to light. She kept saying the same things over and over in a wounded voice. How could you do this to us? Do you know what this will do to your father? Do you know what people will say after everything we did for you? After everything we did for you? There it was. The whole world view in a single sentence, delivered through tears. In my mother's mind, she was the victim. I was the ungrateful one. The one dragging the family's name through the mud. The one who couldn't just let it go the way I'd let everything go for 10 years. The tears weren't for me. And they weren't for Grandpa. They were for the reputation, the appearance, the good candles she only lit for people she wanted to impress. I understood finally and completely that I could stand in that room and grieve for the mother I wished I had. But the mother I actually had was crying about her image while her forged crime glowed on a screen behind her. So I did the hardest thing. I stopped reaching. I sat still and I let her cry. And I felt the last thread that tied me to the fantasy of that family go slack in my hands. There was nothing left to save, only something left to decide. The mediation was held 2 weeks later in a long conference room at a firm downtown with a neutral mediator at the head of the table and the two sides facing each other across it. On my side, Grace and me. On theirs, my parents and their lawyer, and at the far end, sitting slightly apart from everyone, as if she didn't know which side she belonged on, my sister. Sophie had been named in the proceedings because of the gift letter, because of the money that had passed through her hands. She sat there in a thin cardigan, 6 months out from losing everything, looking like she might dissolve into the carpet, and every so often she would glance at me with an expression of pure terror. She knew what I knew, that the evidence in Grace's folder could recover my inheritance, and in the same motion, mark her as a participant in the fraud. She had handed me the weapon, and now she sat at the end of the table, waiting to find out if I would use it on her, too. The air conditioning hummed. Someone had set out a picture of water and a stack of paper cups that nobody touched. The mediator, a calm, gay-haired woman, opened by explaining the purpose of the day, that we were here to reach a resolution both sides could accept, to avoid the cost and exposure of a trial. My father sat with his arms crossed, still radiating that terrible certainty. And I sat very still, my hands folded on the table, calm in a way that surprised even me, because I had already done my crying, done my grieving, done my deciding. At a kitchen table full of documents at 2 a.m, I knew what I was going to do. One Hedman and another knew yet was that the quiet daughter had come to the table holding all the cards and had already decided how to play them. Grace spoke first, and she was surgical. She laid the evidence on the table one piece at a time, not with drama, just with the quiet weight of facts that cannot be argued with. The genuine will, notarized, dated, naming me as sole beneficiary of a $2.4 million trust, the filed will with its forged signature, Dr. Alvarez's forensic report, concluding that the filed signature was not made by my grandfather's hand. The trust records showing my father as successor trustee, liquidating the account on the strength of a trust revocation my grandfather never signed. She spoke for about 15 minutes, and by the end of it, the certainty had drained out of the room like water out of a cracked basin. My parents' lawyer, who had clearly not been given the full picture by his clients, had gone pale and stopped taking notes. Then Grace said the words that changed the temperature of the room. "I want to be very clear about what this evidence establishes," she said, addressing the mediator, but letting it land on the whole table. "This is not a dispute about interpretation. This is documented forgery and misappropriation of trust assets. These are felonies. If this evidence were presented to a prosecutor, my client's parents would be facing criminal charges carrying significant prison time." My father's arms uncrossed, my mother's hand went to her throat. And at the end of the table, Sophie made a small sound because Grace wasn't finished. And Grace continued more quietly. Because Miss Sophie Barrett signed documents that facilitated the transfer of stolen funds, she too could be exposed to criminal liability as a participant. Sophie's face went white. She looked at me, and in her eyes was not a plea for mercy, but a kind of acceptance, like she'd always known it might end here, that the debt would come due for her too. And that was the moment. Everyone at that table was waiting to see what I would do. Grace turned to me. "Evelyn," she said, "it's your decision." Grace laid the 2 roads on the table as plainly as she'd laid down the evidence so that everyone in that room understood exactly what was in my hands. "There are 2 ways this ends," she said. "The first is criminal. My client refers this evidence to the district attorney. There is a strong likelihood of charges for forgery and fraud. Mr. and Mrs. Barrett could be convicted. They could serve time, and given her signature on the transfer documents, Miss Sophie Barrett could be charged as well. That is one road, and my client is fully within her rights to take it." She let that sit. My father's certainty was gone now. He was staring at the table like a man watching the floor open. "The second road is civil," Grace went on. "The parties acknowledge in a signed and binding legal document the existence of the genuine will and the fraud committed against my client. The trust assets and full accounting of what was taken from them are returned to Evelyn Barrett. In exchange, my client agrees not to bring this evidence to the district attorney and to keep it sealed inside the civil settlement. I'll be honest with the room. No private party can promise a prosecutor will never act on his own. But with no referral and no evidence in anyone's hands, there is no case for anyone to build. In practice, that means no charges, no prison. The family keeps its freedom. My client recovers what was always hers. The truth is put on the record, and everyone walks out of this room and goes home." She folded her hands. One road ends with the Barretts in a courtroom facing a judge. The other ends with them signing a piece of paper and keeping their liberty. My client has decided which road she wants. Evelyn. Every face in that room turned to me. My father, who had told me to stop begging for attention, who had just told me a doctor was worth more than an accountant, who was not sorry and would do it again. My mother crying about her reputation, and Sophie at the end of the table, thin and gray and terrified, the sister who had wronged me. And then at the very bottom of her life, chosen to make it right. 2 roads. In one hand, everything I was owed and the power to destroy them all. In the other, everything I was owed and something harder. I took a breath and I told them how it was going to end. Before I could speak, my father did the thing I should have expected. He broke. All that terrible certainty, all that pride. It turned in an instant to fury. Because men like my father don't feel fear as fear. They feel it as rage. This is vindictive, he snapped, standing halfway out of his chair, jabbing a finger at me across the table. This is what this is. You couldn't stand that we believed in your sister, so you waited 10 years, and now you're trying to put your own parents in prison over money. Over money that's already spent. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family? You always were jealous of her. Your grandfather felt sorry for you. That's the only reason he left you anything, and you've turned it into a weapon to destroy us. You should be ashamed. His lawyer was tugging at his sleeve, telling him to sit down, to stop talking. My mother was pulling at his other arm, but my father was in full flood now, a decade of certainty pouring out of him, and the room filled with the sound of his voice getting louder and higher and less steady. And here is the strange thing. As my father lost control, I found for the first time in my life that I had all of it. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry or shake or beg. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded, and I let him rage. And I understood something I'd been learning my whole life without knowing it. The quiet person in the room is not the weak one. She's the one who has already decided. My whole childhood, my father's volume had been power. His anger had filled every room and made me small. And now he was louder than he'd ever been, jabbing his finger red in the face. And it had no power at all, because I was not begging for anything anymore. When he finally ran out of words and stood there breathing hard, the mediator asked him to sit. He sat, and into the silence that followed, calm and clear, I finally spoke. I'm not begging anymore, I said. I'm telling you how this ends. My voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Every person at that table leaned in to hear me. And I understood that this quiet was the power I'd been denied my whole life, and had finally stopped asking anyone's permission to hold for 10 years. I said I believed I was the kind of person who begs. Dad told me that in front of our whole family, the same week you stole $2.4 million from me. And I believed him because when the people who are supposed to love you tell you what you are, you believe them. I built a whole life around not wanting anything so that no one could ever call me a beggar again. I want to thank you for that, actually. It made me very good at my job. It made me the kind of person who could sit across from you today and not fall apart. I looked at my father. You said a doctor was worth more than an accountant. You've spent your whole life ranking people by what they're worth to your reputation. Your father did it to you. I know that. I heard it in the way you talk. So, I'm not going to pretend you're a monster. You're just a man who learned that love is something you spend on the child who will make you look good, and you never learned anything else. Then I said the part I decided at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. I'm taking the civil road. You'll return every dollar of the trust, and you'll sign a document that says, in plain language, what you did. Not because I'm merciful, because I refuse to become someone who measures out justice by how much it hurts. I could send you to prison. I'm choosing not to. But understand me. This is not forgiveness for you. This is me refusing to let you turn me into you. I turned to Sophie, who is staring at me with tears running silently down her face. And Sophie is not a participant in anything. That is my condition, and it is not negotiable. She gave me the truth when she had nothing left to gain from it. Whatever the law says she is the only person at this table who chose to do the right thing. She walks out of here, clean. The room was utterly silent. I had won, and it had cost me the last thing I had left to lose. Grace slid a document across the table toward me, and I understood that winning was going to require one more signature, and that this one would cost me more than my father's forgery had cost him. It was the settlement agreement drafted in advance for exactly this outcome. It returned the trust. It put the fraud on the record. It released my parents from criminal referral, and released Sophie from any liability. And it did one more thing quietly in its final paragraph. A thing Grace had explained to me beforehand and I had asked her to include. It was in effect an ending. By signing it, both sides acknowledged that this was a final resolution, that there would be no further claims, no further contact required, no further anything. It was the legal language for what I already knew in my body. I was not going to have a family after this. There would be no reconciliation dinner, no tearful holiday, no slow rebuilding. My father was not sorry. My mother wept for her reputation. Signing this paper meant recovering my grandfather's money and losing forever, and by my own hand. The fantasy I'd carried since I was 22. The fantasy that someday they would see me and it would all be worth it. I looked at the pen. I thought about my grandfather teaching me to reconcile a checkbook at his kitchen table, telling me I had a mind like a lockbox. The only adult who ever looked at me like I was already enough. He had tried to leave me something, not just money, a message, that I was worth setting something aside for. My parents had spent 10 years trying to make me forget it. And now I held the pen that would finally make it true at the cost of admitting that the people in this room would never be the family I wanted. Both things at once, the winning and the losing, arriving in the same signature. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady the way my grandfather's had been steady, the way my father's had trembled. And I signed my name, my own real name, Evelyn Barrett, to the truth. When I set the pen down, no one applauded. There was no music, no gasp, no dramatic collapse. That's not how these things end in real life. My father did not apologize. He signed where his lawyer pointed, his jaw tight. A man complying with a defeat he still believed was an injustice done to him. My mother signed too, dabbing at her eyes, still murmuring about everything they'd done for me. Neither of them looked at me and I realized I had stopped waiting for them too. That was the self-knowledge that arrived quietly as I kept that pen. For 10 years, I had believed my father's word about me, that I'd begged for attention, that wanting to be seen was a weakness. And sitting there, having just told a room full of people exactly how things would go, I finally understood the truth. I had never been begging. I had only ever been asking to be loved, which is not the same thing at all, and is not shameful, and is the most ordinary thing in the world. A child asking to be loved is not a beggar. And the fact that my parents couldn't give it was never ever a verdict on my worth. It had taken me 32 years, a forged will, and a payphone call in the rain to learn it. At the end of the table, Sophie was crying, but her whole body had changed, like something that had been clenched for a decade had finally let go. She mouthed something at me across the table and I read her lips clearly. "Thank you." I gave her the smallest nod. Whenever we were now, whenever we could be, it would have to be built later, slowly from the ground up by two women who had both survived the same house in different ways. But that was a thing for another day. For today, it was enough that we had both finally chosen the truth. I walked out of that conference room into a bland downtown hallway with fluorescent lights and a water fountain and a window at the end, looking out over the city. And I stopped there at that window, and for the first time in 10 years, I breathed all the way to the bottom of my lungs. I want to tell you I felt triumph. But I didn't. Triumph is what you feel when you beat someone. This wasn't that. What I felt was lighter and stranger and harder to name. I felt like a person who had been carrying a heavy box for so long she'd forgotten it was there and had finally, in a quiet room, set it down. My father was still my father back in that room, still certain, still unsorry. The house I grew up in still had good candles for people worth impressing. The world had not rearranged itself to admit I'd been wronged. Nothing had been undone. But I had my grandfather's money, which had never really been about the money. And I had something I hadn't walked into that room with. I had myself back, The quiet, careful, over-armored woman who'd spent a decade proving she didn't need anyone. And underneath her, still alive, the girl at a kitchen table who a good man had once told was enough. Grace came out and found me at the window. "You did it," she said. "Most people can't. Most people, when they get the power to hurt the ones who hurt them, they use it. You didn't." I kept looking out at the city. "It wouldn't have made me feel better," I said. "It would have just made me one of them." And I meant it, but I also knew the money was going to do something. I just hadn't decided what yet. It turned out my grandfather had already told me. Here is what happened in the year that followed. Because I know you want to know, and because real life doesn't wrap up as neatly as we'd like. The trust came back to me. After the accounting, after the return of what had been moved and the recovery of what remained, it settled at just over $2.1 million, most of what my grandfather had set aside. The rest paid out from my parents' own assets under the agreement. My parents kept their freedom and their house, and they lost something they cared about more than either, which was their standing among the relatives, because word of a forged will has a way of traveling through a family, no matter how quiet everyone tries to be. My father never once said he was sorry. I have made my peace with the fact that he never will. Sophie walked out of that room without a criminal record, but she did not walk into an easy redemption because there isn't one. She entered a treatment program. She will never practice medicine again. She is, last I heard, working at a front desk and going to meetings and rebuilding a life from studs. Slowly, honestly, for the first time as her own and not as the thing her parents spent a stolen fortune to make her. We talk now carefully, a little more each month. It is not the sisterhood we might have had, but it is real and it is ours. And neither of us had that before. I did not keep the money, not most of it. That surprised the people who knew the story, and it surprised me a little too, until I understood why. My grandfather had not set that trust aside because he wanted me to be rich. He set it aside because he wanted me to know I was worth setting something aside for. That was the real inheritance, and it wasn't a number. So, I took the thing that had been meant to prove my worth, and I used it to prove other people's. I established a scholarship fund. I named it the Walter Hayes Scholarship, after the only person who ever looked at me and saw enough. And I set it up to do one specific thing. Each year, it fully funds the education of gifted students from poor families. The kind of students who work themselves to the top of a class and then watch someone else get the party. The kind of kids who might one day stand on a stage, valedictorian, and glance out at the audience, hoping someone came. I wanted there to be someone. I kept enough to be secure to never again be trapped anywhere by money. Because that lesson too was hard won. But the rest, the real bulk of it, I gave away in my grandfather's name to children who would never know my father's rule. That love is a prize awarded to whoever brings the most status home. In my grandfather's fund, being brilliant and poor and overlooked is exactly enough. A little over a year after I signed my name to the truth in that conference room, I sat in the audience of a graduation ceremony at a public high school in a hard part of the city. I had been invited because the young woman giving the valedictorian speech that day was the first recipient of the Walter Hayes Scholarship. Her name was Maya. She was 17. She had raised 2 younger siblings while working nights and finishing at the top of her class, and she had gotten into a university she could never in 100 years have afforded on her own. I sat in a folding chair in a hot gymnasium, an anonymous woman in the crowd, and I watched her walk up to the podium in a cap and gown, and I thought about a June night 10 years ago when a girl in a cap and gown had come home to a party that wasn't for her. Maya adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the audience, and there was a nervousness in her face that I recognized all the way down to my bones. The look of a young person who has done something remarkable and is scanning the crowd, hoping someone came. Hoping someone would see. I knew that look. I had worn it myself, holding a diploma nobody asked to see. And so I did the one thing nobody had done for me. Before she said a single word, I put my hands together and I began to applaud. Maya gave her speech and it was good. And when she finished, the whole gymnasium was on its feet. Afterward, she found me in the crowd because someone had told her who I was, and she took both my hands and hers and thanked me, not for the money, but for what she called the letter that came with it. A short note I'd written to each recipient. She said one line of it had gotten her through her hardest nights. I had written to each of them the same thing. The thing I wished someone had told a 22-year-old girl on a June night long ago. It said only this: you do not have to earn the right to be seen, and you should never ever have to beg for it. Standing in that gymnasium, holding the hands of a girl who would never know my father's rule, I understood that this was what my grandfather had meant all along. Not the money, the message. That every gifted, overlooked, unwanted child deserves at least one person who sets something aside for them, who says before they've proven a single thing that they are already enough. Nobody should ever have to beg to be seen. That is my story. A cake with the wrong name. A diploma lying face down on a table. A father who told me to stop begging while his hand trembled over a signature that was never really his. A payphone ringing in the rain. In the end, I got back what was stolen, and I gave most of it away. And I learned that the people who couldn't see me were never the measure of my worth. If you have ever sat in a room where the love went to someone else and quietly wondered what was wrong with you, let me tell you plainly, nothing was wrong with you. There never was. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment and tell me, and subscribe so you never miss the next one, because there is always someone out there being told they beg for attention when all they ever did was ask to be loved.